Good day, everyone. Before we begin, we would like to introduce ourselves. I am Gabriel Michael M. Capuyan.
I am Andrea DEOCAMPO.
My name is SANDIG.
Aled Espinosa Geronimo.
Factor influencing the food choice of the School of Business and Governance students of a higher education towards the consumption of Korean cuisine. What is the study about? The study is about determining the relationship between food influences, ideals, personal factors, resources, social framework, and food context, and the likelihood of choosing Korean food cuisine among the SPG students of Ateneo de Davao University. So why study? So that the consumers may be informed, aware, and assess what are the food influences that may affect or the reason for them to likely choose Korean cuisine as a food choice. What is our motivation? To see whether the variables under food influences, ideals, personal factor, resources, social framework, and food context has a significant relationship with the likelihood of choosing Korean food cuisine as a food choice. Purpose of the study. First is to explore the influences and relationship of the variables. Second is to contribute to the improvement of the Korean business restaurants and inspiring entrepreneurs, which would help them to assess the needs and wants of their customers, and to the consumers who are interested in the consumption of Korean cuisine. This study may serve as a reference for their future study and research about the factors that affect the food choice of the consumers towards the consumption of Korean cuisine, and this study could be improved by future students and researchers, and may encourage the higher education to include the study as a part of education and learning, specifically on the marketing and entrepreneurship of the students. Limitation of the study. In this study, the researchers determined if ideals, personal factors, resources, social framework, and food context has an influence on the food choice of SBG students towards the consumption of Korean cuisine. The School of Business and Government's undergraduate programs involve 7 courses: Bachelor of Science in Accounting, Management Accounting, Business Management, Entrepreneurship major in Agricultural Business, Finance, Human Resource Management, and Bachelor in Public Management. Limit to 400 students of SBG of a higher education, strictly conducted online through the use of Google Forms and the distribution of questionnaire to the corresponding respondent.
For our conceptual framework, our independent variable under the food influences are the following influences, namely the ideals, personal factors, resources, social framework, and food context. And this is anchored or based on the food choices process model of First et al. In 1996. While our dependent variable is the likelihood of Korean cuisine as food choice and is anchored in the theory of planned behavior that is developed by Ajsen in 1985 and 1987. The framework's purpose is to determine whether the food influences would affect the likelihood of Korean cuisine as the food choice of SBG college students of Ateneo de Davao University. For the statement of the problem, the first statement of the problem is what is the demographic profile of the SBG students in terms of their age, gender, course, and allowance. The next slides will present the results of the demographic profile of the respondents. In terms of age, the results showed that most of the respondents were aged 18 to 21 years old, consisting of 213 respondents, which is 56.66% of the total qualified respondents. Respondents aged 21 to 24 followed, consisting of 161 respondents, which is 42.8%. In terms of gender, the results showed that most of the respondents are female with a total of 242 respondents with a percentage of 63.3%, and male respondents, which consist of 138 respondents, which is 36.7% of the responses. In terms of the course, the results showed that among the 9 courses, most of the respondents were from Bachelor of Science in Accountancy with 111 responses with a percentage of 29.52%, and the least responses were from Bachelor of Public Management with 2 responses with a percentage of 0.5%. In terms of allowance, the results showed that most of the respondents have a weekly allowance range of 501 pesos to 5,000 pesos, with a total of 173 respondents with a percentage of 63.2%. In the second statement of the problem, the level of influence in choosing Korean cuisine is represented in the next slides in a tabular form. The first influence, which is the ideals, the table explains that the statements have an average mean of 3.10 and a standard deviation of 0.43, which is then interpreted as having a high level of ideals. The second component, which is the personal factor, the table explains that the statements have an average mean of 2.88 and a standard deviation of 0.48, which is then interpreted as having a high level of personal factor. The third influence, which is the resources, the table explains that the statements have an average mean of 3.17 and a standard deviation of 0.47, which is then interpreted as having a high level of resources. The fourth influence, which is the social framework, the table explains that the statements have an average mean of 2.91 and a standard deviation of 0.54, which is then interpreted as having a high level of social framework. Lastly, the fifth influence, which is the food context, the table explains that the statements have an average mean of 3.26 and a standard deviation of 0.48, which is then interpreted as having a very high level of food context. In the third statement of the problem, the likelihood of Korean cuisine as food choice of the SBG students are represented in the next slide. Most of the respondents chose a rating of 8 in the likelihood of choosing Korean cuisine, which is 37.8% of the total qualified respondents or 142 respondents. Followed by the rating of 7, the total responses were 79, which is 21% of the total qualified respondents. For the fourth statement of the problem, this is to determine if there is a significant relationship between the influences and the likelihood of Korean cuisine as food choice among the School of Business and Governance students' food choice. The table explains and shows the correlation of all the variables and the variables' significant relationship on the likelihood of Korean cuisine as food choice. Results showed that all the variables have a significant relationship on the likelihood of Korean cuisine as food choice. A low and positive relationship was observed in the ideals, personal factors, and food context, while a very low and positive relationship was observed in the resources and social framework. The hypothesis, or HO, therefore, is to be rejected.
For the last statement of the problem, thus influences, the ideals, personal factors, resources, social framework, and food context have a significant influence on the likelihood of Korean cuisine as food choice among SBG students. And in order to get this, the researchers did some various tests. First is the multicollinearity test, and this test for us researchers to know that our predictor or independent variables are not correlated with each other. And as you can see, the highest variance inflation factor is 1.553, which is the ideal and is lower than the value of 10. And this indicates that the variance inflation factor confirmed that the variables are entirely independent from one another, and all the VIF or the variance inflation factor are below 10 and tolerance factor of not less than 0.10. Another test is to determine if the residuals are normally distributed, and as you can see, it was confirmed that the variables are normally distributed because the QQ plot shows that the standardized residuals fit along the diagonal line. And multiple linear regression analysis also requires that there will be little or no autocorrelation, and the Durbin-Watson statistics will always have a value ranging between 0 and 4. And as you can see, that the Durbin-Watson autocorrelation value was 0.026 and test statistics of 1.938 and the AP value of 0.544, and this suggests that the data sets have no autocorrelation. For the homoscedasticity test, the residuals and predicted plots are reflected to test the homoscedasticity, and this is an assumption of equal or similar variances in different groups being compared. And as you can see, there is a balanced distribution of the residuals around the baseline, and this suggests that the assumption of homoscedasticity is fulfilled. Lastly, the summary table of influence of ideals, personal factors, resources, social framework, and food context, and the likelihood of Korean food cuisine as food choice, and results shows that the independent variables except social framework and food context significantly predict the dependent variable preference of Korean food as cuisine choice, specifically for ideals, personal factors, and for resources. And among these three variables that influence significantly, the variable ideal has the greatest weight of influence on the respondents' extent to choose Korean food cuisine. The regression model also tallied an R which is equals to 0.428, which means that the relationship of the sets of IV towards the DV is moderate, and the R square value of 0.184 means that 18.4% in the variation of respondents extent on the Korean food cuisine as a choice can be attributed to the sets of 5 sets of independent variables including ideals, personal factor, resources, social framework, and food context, and an F value which is equals to 16.636 and a p-value which is less than 0.001 suggests model fitness.
Moving on to the implications in theory. So the study was referred into two theories, so the food choice process model and the theory of planned behavior. It was found that the factors in food choice process model has an impact in decision-making process of the consumer. Furthermore, these are reflected in the results of the study. As previously mentioned, all the variables under influence have a significant relationship on the respondent's likelihood of Korean cuisine as a choice. In the theory of planned behavior, it stated that a person's behavior depends on its intentions, which can cause motivational changes and willingness to carry out behavior, and also perceived behavioral control that refers to a person's behavior's interest. Therefore, the theory of planned behavior is very suited for the research. Next is the implications in practice. So the findings of the study will help in the assessment of how students are influenced regarding their food choices, and to identify the likelihood of choosing Korean cuisine, and to allow entrepreneurs to identify the influences of consumers' purchase of the cuisine. It is also to help the entrepreneurs modify strategies about promotion, marketing, and advertising. Next is the implication to research. So this research would contribute information for future studies using the food choice process model, which will also serve as a basis to determine the level of influence of the consumers, and the study would also contribute to the comprehension on how behavior of a consumer could contribute to the motivation or willingness of it to carry out a behavior. Lastly, the result of the study would provide more knowledge and information for future researchers and Korean restaurant businesses that they can use for references to fully understand and explain further relationship of likelihood of choosing Korean food cuisine and the level of influences of a consumer towards the consumption of Korean cuisine. That focuses not just on the consumers residing in Davao City but also consumers residing in the Philippines.
For the conclusion, most of the respondents of this study were consumers aged 18 to 21 years old, and in terms of frequency of consuming Korean cuisine, most of the respondents consume Korean food once a month, and majority of the respondents of this study who consume Korean cuisine are also female. Second, the 5 influences of choosing Korean cuisine showed a high level of relevance and impact, and the high level implies that consumers choose Korean food because of their curiosity with its taste. Consumers' choice of Korean food depends on their experience with the Korean cuisine, that the consumers choose a certain Korean food depending on their budget, and consumers are also or more likely to enjoy Korean food with their friends. Lastly, consumers' choice of Korean food depends on how presentable is the food on the menu and is based on how well the dish is presented. And this shows that the level of influence of Korean food to the consumers in general is very high, which indicates that the SBG students of a higher education are highly influenced towards choosing Korean cuisine as their food choice. Third, relationship between 5 factors of influence and likelihood of Korean cuisine as food choice are all related significantly to the food influences of consumers, and this implies that SBG students of higher education are more likely to choose Korean food as their food choice, driven by the following influential factors: ideals, personal factors, resources, social framework, and food context. An overall analysis, it shows that the relationship of the likelihood of Korean cuisine as food choice and food influences of SBG students of a higher education represent a low positive relationship, which indicates that as the likelihood of Korean cuisine as food choice of students increases, the way they are influenced when making a food choice increases to a certain degree as well. For the recommendations, based on the findings and conclusions, it is recommended that Korean food businesses should always consider quality control to ensure the taste or flavor of their food product that meets the preferences of the consumers. Korean food businesses should consider offering budget-friendly prices since budget is also a prominent factor according to the consumers. And business managers should try to think of a different possible food promotions that could give the consumers a good deal without sacrificing the quality and cost of the product. And addressing consumers who are more likely to enjoy Korean food with their friends, Korean food businesses and restaurants should try to offer food bundles that are best for groups like groups of friends and families. And the menu should be well organized, and that picture of every food product should be there and presentable to look at. And the menu should be used or should use appropriate colors and design relevant to the food that will help customers to be more likely to order. And it is recommended that Korean restaurants should consider preparing their food very presentable as much as they can. For consumers, it is recommended that they also engage in researching good quality Korean food that would best fit their choices and that they continue to participate in studies like this to better understand the preferences of people nowadays. And lastly, for students, researchers, and academic institutions such as Ateneo de Davao University, it is recommended that they make use of this study as an additional body of knowledge for future references, considering the continuous trend of Korean cuisine in today's society.